All right, I'm going to take you on a long trip back in history. Ready? In 587 BC, the mighty Babylonian Empire, they were, imagine 20th century United States without nuclear weapons. But the mighty Babylonian Empire defeated Jerusalem. Now, many Israelites were killed, and many were also taken back to live in Babylon as exiles. That's what you did back then. Rivers were important in Babylon because they're partly how they got to be so prosperous as a nation in the first place. Babylon was located in a river valley, and Babylonians were experts at building canals and irrigation systems, which is a pretty big deal when you live in a land that is prone to drought. Now, often conqueror nations like to view themselves as being the savior of nations they defeated or that they occupy. They thought that their form of government, their way of life, their predominant religion were superior, the culmination of human history. Sound familiar? Because we've often seen that attitude at work in our own foreign policy. And in fact, if you found yourself as an exile in Babylon, things were not all that bad for you, at least from a material point of view. You could do quite well if you settled there and made a life for yourself. It might be like any of us being exiled to, let's say, Louisiana. You could work, you wouldn't have to worry about famine or drought. The land is green and lush there, but people in Louisiana, as great as they are, have a very different way of speaking. Their accents are different. The food is spicy and full of crawdads, which are really just big bugs. And you have to watch out for alligators and snakes. And you have to keep your eyes peeled for men with long beards and guns who live in swamps and speak French. Now, don't get me wrong, I like Louisiana, but it's a different world down there. Mostly the problem if you're in exile is that you would be there not by choice, but because you were forced to be there. You'd miss home. You'd miss the changing of the seasons because the only season in Louisiana is hot and humid. You'd miss your friends and family who got left behind. It would be traumatic. It'd even be more traumatic if you were also in a place where your cherished beliefs, your religious practices, your spiritual sense of self, your grounding in what was right and what's wrong, and your option to follow your ethical and moral and certainly your political inclinations were restricted or prohibited. So that was the life of an exile, a life where your very identity as a person was in danger of just being erased. And that's why the psalmist paints for us the picture of a group of exiles sitting by the rivers of Babylon, weeping and lamenting all that they'd lost, mourning their isolation, their despondent feeling of having the rug pulled right out from under them and not being able to do anything about it. Then the author of the psalm goes on to say how the Babylonians asked the Israelites to play for them some songs of Zion. Play us some of the greatest hits from the Israel Top 40 charts. Now, it could be that they did this out of spite or they were making fun of them, but Babylonians were like anyone else. They weren't inherently bad people just because they happened to live in a big empire. It could very well be the Babylonians just didn't understand why these newcomers would be expressing such distress at living there. You can even imagine the Babylonians saying something like, "Cheer up! This is a great place to live. You ought to be grateful. Let's cook up some gumbo. And hey, how about you sing us one of those catchy songs from your land?" In response, the Israelites hung their musical instruments up in the trees. In protest, they refused to play. It was a protest to be pressured, to forget, and to move on. And I think we can all relate to that. And if you can't quite relate, one of these days you probably will. You can name just about any kind of trauma that we go through: the loss of a job, the death of a parent or a spouse or a child, losing some of or maybe most of your mobility, needing to move away from home. Those things are part of living, and when they happen, it's inevitable that we have well-intentioned people around us who kind of remind me of those Babylonians from long ago, because they'll say things like, "Hey, look around, it's not so bad. Don't you think it's time to move on and get on with your life? Haven't you gone through Some of those stages of grief I've been reading about, when are you going to get over it? When people say stuff like that to us, I don't think they're trying to be insensitive. A large part of it may be that they're uncomfortable with our process of working through our loss. They don't know what to do with us, really, or how to act around us. And it can be hard for them to see from their perspective that when we lose anything or anyone significant to us, that it's as if a big piece of ourself has been lopped right off. That's because our identity, that stable sense of who we are, it doesn't develop in a vacuum. We know who we are based on our relationships with others. Think of any highly regarded profession, let's say a physician. Now, this isn't true for every doctor, but I've known many who, when they retired, really went through a hard period of readjustment. They were no longer being asked to care for people, to make diagnosis, to create a plan for healing. Patients were no longer coming in looking for answers from them. So many of those doctors felt lost. They were the same person as before they retired, and yet their identity as a doctor, which had so defined them, was not there, at least not to the extent that they depended on other people to relate to them as a doctor. And the same is true for so many types of work. Don't even get me started on ministers. My God. Many of them, especially because they understand ministry as a lifelong vocation, they find it incredibly hard when they're no longer serving a church or being a chaplain at a hospital. My own dad was like that. He continued doing pastoral counseling and he volunteered in churches right up until he physically just could not manage it any longer because of his Parkinson's disease. He could not imagine anyone not relating to him and regarding him as a minister. And again, that can be true for any occupation. It can be true for any kind of relationship because our identities don't spring from nothing. You're a spouse or a partner, a parent, a child, a grandparent, a neighbor, or a friend because of at least one other person for whom you are that spouse or parent or child or friend. So it's kind of funny. We can think of ourselves as strong, autonomous, and independent individuals who exist in and who control our own minds and bodies. But the truth is, we're all bound up in a whole web of intersecting relationships that give us our identity. Think of it this way. If an essential part of your identity is that you're an American, a citizen or resident of the United States, where did that come from? It's because, well, you were likely born to Americans, you grew up surrounded by Americans, and you continue to live in close proximity to Americans. And for most, if not all of that identity making, you had no choice in the matter. The same kind of relational identity can be true based on your ethnicity or your gender. If you understand yourself as a conservative or as a liberal, how did you come to that conclusion? It's based on sharing a certain perspective with other people. No doubt, each of our identities is a really complex stew. If I was abducted by aliens and their first question to me was, "Who are you?" Beyond giving them my name, which is only one symbol of my identity, I might not know where to even begin in trying to express who I am. I'm a guy. My ancestors came from England and Ireland and Scotland, so I'm a very white guy. I'm married to a woman. I'm a dad. I'm a baby boomer. I'm healthy, thank God. And oh, speaking of God, I am what you call a Christian. Now, what did I leave out? What do I do for a living? The kind of movies I like, my favorite music, my stubborn refusal to have a TikTok account. There are lots of ingredients in my gumbo. So the loss of any of that means a loss of my identity in some way. And of course, not all the parts of my identity are created equal. The most important parts are those that carry the heaviest emotional freight. And I mean emotional in a positive way. Many of us here have experienced the loss of that, the pain of that loss, the loss of what was the most important relationship you had with another person. That kind of loss can really throw us for a loop, precisely because we've invested so much of ourselves into it. There's an old saying, and I've been saying it for so long at funerals, I don't even remember if I came up with it or someone else did. The saying is this: we would not hurt so much if we did not love so much. And that's one of the ironies of living, isn't it? None of us would ever give up the love we have and we hold, and none of us would forego being a spouse or partner or parent or friend and have that relationship form so much of our identity, even though we know that one day we may find ourselves without the immediate physical presence of that person we love. And with that essential piece of our identity stripped away, it can take a very long time to regain any sense of equilibrium, to begin reinventing who we are. And there's never any neat and clean set of stages or a preordained time frame that anyone gets over that. You never truly get over it. The best you can do is travel through it. It's a lot like finding yourself as an exile, standing by a river in a land you never bargained for, feeling far away from home and all that matters and all that formed who you are. And well-meaning people are bound to come up to you with concerned looks on their faces and say, "Why don't you play one of those old songs? It's good here. Look around. Time to get on with your life." No thanks. I'm going to hang up my harp on this tree over here. I need this time. Now, I only say this so that we can all be reminded to be patient and kind to anyone we know who has lost a significant piece of their identity, to be quiet, because filling the silence with a lot of talk might make us more comfortable, but that's about all it's doing. We are often those well-intentioned Babylonians. We may have even been through a loss of identity ourselves, but time has helped us forget what that immediate trauma feels like. There is a promise, though, in the midst of going through what the ancient Israelites experienced, and really what any of us go through whenever our identity has been stolen away. The promise and the truth is, we are more resilient than we might imagine, because in our heads and in our hearts, if we love, and of course we all do, and if we are who we are because of our relationships with others, and of course we are, we cannot escape the conclusion that love is the connective tissue of relationships, and love itself, we believe, is more powerful and enduring than any kind of loss. We continue to love, and we will always love. Love is in the past and in the future, in our memory and in our hope. I happen to think believing that is the basis of any positive religion. It's the foundation of any faith that's healing, peacemaking, forgiving, unifying, and universal. And universal meaning it covers and embraces everyone and everything. Our faith does just that. Our faith is completely about relationships with family, friends, and people we are tied to, past, present, and future, whom we may never even meet in this life. So our faith is not something we can hold inside just for ourselves. No, we don't hide it under a bushel, but we let it shine. Because that light's not just meant for us. Our identity is relational. It's made up of what others see in us, and you and I are the bearers of that light. We may and we will occasionally need to sit by the river and weep and lament. That's a fact. But we're never alone in that. We're in relationship through love, through the past, in our present, and into the future. And that's where the river of love flows.